Good day. Today, 15th August, I've noticed that the Western media, and indeed some of the media in Russia, have been talking less about the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine, where, of course, news for Ukraine is becoming increasingly bleak, and have instead focused on the issue of the ruble and on the Russian central bank's decision to raise interest rates by 3.5 percentage points. Well, I'm going to discuss that later in this program. I'm going to take the reverse position to that of the Western media, and indeed, as I said, some parts of the Russian media. I continue to think, as by the way, the central bank also appears to think, that the weakening of the ruble that we are currently witnessing is a temporary phenomenon. And I've discussed some of the reasons why I think that in yesterday's program and in other programs. And I continue to think that longer term, going forward, it is the situation on the battlefronts that is what really matters. That is what is going to determine the future of Ukraine, the future of Russia, and as more and more people around the world are gradually coming to agree, the future of the world indeed generally. So what has been going on the battlefronts? Well, the short answer is that the situation remains pretty much as it was yesterday. Ukraine continues its various offensives. These offensives that it has been undertaking over the last 2.5 months have been making little progress, and we're getting increasing comments now from Russian officials and indeed from lots of other officials, and of course, as we've seen, commentaries in the West, in the media in the West now, especially in the United States, conceding that the offensive is not going well and that the likelihood is that it will eventually fail. And there have been some comments to that effect by various Russian officials. I believe it was Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk regional government, who said to TASS yesterday that to all intents and purposes, the Ukrainian offensive is now ebbing. It's losing its momentum. It's lost its momentum. He said that it's possible that there will be local events in particular places, but principally now we're talking about flashpoints rather than a general Ukrainian advance across the front lines. And he said that he expects that by September at the latest, it will all be over, though he also seems to think that in fact it could be sooner than that. It might even be just a few weeks away. Well, that was what we heard, as I said, various Russian officials say. We'll see whether that is correct. But anyway, I've just found the report. It was in fact Denis Pushilin, and I'll read it. Now that I found it, I might as well read exactly what he said. And he told TASS, and he was speaking to TASS at the Army 2023 Forum, which is, by the way, attended by the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. He said the following, or he's quoted by TASS as saying the following: "For now, I will not call it a second counteroffensive compared to what we saw in the first wave under the initial counteroffensive, which is still underway, but it is rapidly running out of steam." Now, what he's saying is that the Western media, Ukrainian officials back in July, gave the impression that at the end of July, Ukraine was going to go back on the attack, that they were going to put together a big armored fist, and that would break through the Russian front lines. This was the attack of the 10th Corps that took place in the last week of July and which was unsuccessful. And people were talking about this in the West as the second part of the counteroffensive. I refer to it as the reboot of the counteroffensive. Well, Pushilin says that he doesn't buy any of that. There's only been one counteroffensive that's been on the go since the 4th of June, and it is now, according to him, running out of steam. A few hot spots remain along the front line, but the battle readiness of the Russian armed forces is at a completely different level than it was just since 6 months ago, let alone a year ago. And he clearly doesn't think that this offensive is going to lead to any breakthroughs. So that's Pushilin's view. And there have been other comments by other Russian officials, but also we have, for example, some comments from G.A. I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, the chief of the General Staff of the Czech Armed Forces, and he's also been the Czech Republic's defense minister and representative at NATO. And he has said that, he's quoted as saying, the state of Ukraine's counteroffensive in mid-August is unsatisfactory. Illogically optimistic expectations have distorted the picture of the state of Ukrainian troops ahead of this offensive. The Ukrainian command advertised its offensive well ahead of its launch, inspiring hopes that Ukraine would batter Russian troops. The reality has proved to be a far cry from what is proclaimed. The biggest mistake was to launch the offensive simultaneously in 3 areas. I know several people have pointed this out, that Ukraine attacking in 3 different directions, from Orechov towards Rabotino, and beyond that towards Tokmak and Melitopol. Ukraine also attacking in the Vremivka salient area, with hopes of pushing on ultimately to Mariupol, and thirdly in the Bakhmut area. Anyway, 3 different offensives, all launched in different places. It has divided Ukraine's forces instead of concentrating them, as perhaps Ukraine needed to do. But anyway, Mr. Siadivi, General Siadivi, presumably, thinks that was a mistake, and he says that the reality, he says that doing that has not crushed the Russians, but it has crushed us. It's interesting that he uses the expression "us" to describe what Ukraine has done. Now, I've discussed in the past the Czech Republic's really rather complicated game in this affair. Basically, since President Pavel was elected president of the Czech Republic has appeared to be an unswerving supporter of NATO, of the United States, of the Western powers, and of Ukraine. It's provided Ukraine with large amounts of military equipment, a certain amount of economic aid, a huge amount of rhetorical support as well. But even as it does that, Czech officials, including General Pavel himself, the president of the Czech Republic, come up with these statements which suggest that they have their doubts, which they're not fully prepared to conceal. It's almost as if they're communicating to their own people. Look, we're part of NATO now, we're part of the EU, we're going to remain loyal to NATO and to the EU. We've seen what happened to the previous Czech president and the previous Czech government, which sometimes gave the impression of being less than loyal. They were the targets of vicious publicity campaigns, attempts to ultimately destabilize them. We're not going to let that happen to us, so we're going to be fully loyal. But that doesn't mean that we're really internally fully signed up to this enterprise. And here we see General Sedivi telling us that he thinks that this whole offensive was illogically optimistic and poorly thought through. It was advertised months in advance. The Russians were given ample opportunity to prepare for it. There was no mystery or secret about where Ukraine was going to attack. The Russians were ready, and it has failed. And instead of the Russians getting crushed, it is the West, as well as Ukraine, that is being crushed. As I said, a very interesting choice of words. So we have these comments, and as I said, the events on the battlefronts basically bear that out. There continue to be sporadic attacks by Ukrainian forces south of Orechov towards Rabotino. Perhaps one day they will manage to capture Rabotino, though I have to say at the moment that is starting to look unlikely. Their chances of pressing on beyond that through the Surovikin line all the way to Tokmak, much less Melitopol or the Sea of Azov, all of that looks extremely unlikely indeed. And certainly it's clear that General Sedivi, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, doesn't expect that. And elsewhere, fighting in Piatikhatki continues sporadically, but it's clear that Ukraine has never succeeded in establishing full control of Piatikhatki. And further advances south of there, along the east bank of the Dnieper, have not been successful. Ukraine continues its efforts to establish some kind of a bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnieper River. And there's been a lot of intrigue about this. There's reports, again, claiming that there are Ukrainian troops somewhere in the area of the Antonovsky Bridge on the east bank of the Dnieper River. There's claims that there are still Ukrainian troops in that village a little bit further north, the Cossack Yards or whatever it was called. There have been earlier reports, by the way, that suggested that the Ukrainians had been driven out of both of these places. I suspect that we're looking at a very mixed and confused picture. I suspect that the Ukrainians do launch attacks. They do try to send probably special forces or the equivalent of special forces, commandos, if you like, troops across the river in small boats that they land. They occupy for some time some pieces of ground, intense fighting. The Russians push them back. Many of these people who've crossed the river in that way are killed. The Russians then drive them out, and then Ukraine tries again. And that has created an impression among some reporters that the Ukrainians have established a permanent presence. But I think if you actually study the reports carefully, that is probably not true. I suspect it's a series of hit-and-run attacks with some hit and some run, but never anything like a bridgehead being established. And if I'm right in what I think, which, by the way, I most definitely believe I am, then once more, the lives of brave men are being sacrificed to very little purpose. And we have also had an attack, more fighting, in the Urozhainoye area, the village, on the Vremevka salient. Now, here again, the fog of war is very deep. It's not entirely clear what is happening there, and there have been some rather passionate reports from soldiers on each side, not unusual given the intensity of the fighting that's taking place for this particular village, some rather impassioned statements about the nature of the fighting for this particular village. Ukraine claimed at one point that it had knocked the Russians out of the village, but it has never formally announced this village's capture. The Russians claim that they're back in control of some parts of the village. Though other reports from the Russian side also say otherwise. The key thing to understand is that this village, like Staromayorsk, which is its close neighbour, appear to be heavily contested. And once more, it is proving very difficult indeed for the Ukrainian forces to move beyond these two villages of Staromayorsk and Orozhainoye. I believe it means harvest, by the way, in English. But anyway, they basically, the Ukrainians at the moment at least, for the moment at least, have basically been fought to a standstill. It's been very intense fighting, lots of shelling. Both villages now are ruined. All the buildings there have been destroyed. Apparently, there's high ground all around these villages. The Russians control part of the high ground. The Ukrainians control other parts of the high ground. That means that it's very difficult for troops from either side to remain in occupation of these two ruined villages. But the key thing is that it's Ukraine that is supposed to be conducting the offensive, and for the moment at least, they're stuck. And here again, some reports that Ukraine is paying disproportionate losses for whatever ground it is taking in this particular area. And of course, this matches up very closely with the descriptions of Ukrainian soldiers describing the fighting for Staromayorsk that I discussed a week to 10 days ago. They also spoke about intensely difficult and bloody fighting to try to capture Staromayorsk, which, as I said in the event, has never been fully captured by Ukraine. And again, one starts to get the sense that many Ukrainian soldiers, even in that part of the front, even though these are more elite soldiers, perhaps better trained, with higher morale, even they are starting to question the entire logic of persisting with the offensive in this area. Now, I'm told that the Surovikin line is around 8 kilometers to the south and east of these two villages. There's apparently another village before the Ukrainians come anywhere close to the Surovikin line. There's a small town in that area as well, which is, from what I can understand, just north of the Surovikin line as well. One way or the other, all of these places would have to be captured by the Ukrainian forces before they were able to push on to Mariupol, where the Russians heavily embedded in all of these places with Russian troops available in significant numbers, and with the Russians having built up reserves. It's very difficult again to see a breakthrough taking place. Further north, the other place where Ukraine has been trying to make advances, the Bakhmut area, as I've discussed over the last few days, it is the Russians who have regained the initiative. Boris Rogin, otherwise known as Colonel Kassad, one of the most insightful but also accurate reporters of the war, speaking obviously and writing obviously from the Russian side. He claims that the Russians are now in full control of Klashayevka, that the Ukrainians have been pushed out of every part of the village that they formerly controlled, that the Russians have fully restored their front lines in the Klashayevka, Kurdymyovka, Andreevka area, that weeks and months of Ukrainian attacks in this area have, to all intents and purposes, achieved nothing. And this is in the one part of the front lines where the Russians have not been able to establish fortified positions, even the more limited sort of fortified positions that they have in the zone of control in front of the major fortified lines, which in this area lie to the east of Bakhmut itself, to the east of Artyomovsk itself, between Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, and the town of Popasnaya further east. So again, Ukraine has made no significant progress here. It spent an enormous amount of energy, effort, it's expended a lot of its equipment, it sacrificed the lives of many of its soldiers as part of the offensive in this area, but it has no gains of any significance to show for all of this. The Russians remain in firm control of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, and all the key villages around it, the villages that were captured during Wagner's offensive in this area, which began in November and ended at the end of May. All of these villages, together with the town of Solidar and, of course, Bakhmut itself, remain under Russian control. So, that's the story of Ukraine's offensive. Now, further north, it's once again very difficult to get a full picture of what is going on. But there were reports yesterday evening that suggested that the situation for the Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk is now becoming critical, that Russian forces have bypassed the village of Sinkovka, that they pushed the Ukrainians off various places, positions that they occupied on an area of high ground known in this conflict, in this area, as the Sinkovka ledge. I'm not sure whether that is what it actually is, that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians off some of these places, that they haven't wasted time trying to capture Sinkovka itself, that they're now pushing hard towards Kupiansk. Apparently the sound of guns can now be heard in the center of Kupiansk itself. In my opinion, it's been within artillery range for some time, and it does look as if increasingly there is going to be some kind of Russian attack on Kupiansk. Perhaps that attack is underway even as I am making this program. Bear in mind that information from these battlefronts comes in dribs and drabs, and one can't always stay fully up to date with what is going on. For the record, and yet again, I would say that most reporters on both sides of this conflict, both the Russian and the Ukrainian, remain embedded with the respective forces further south, in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, in southern Donbass. The Russian offensive in the north appears to have been somewhat unexpected. The result is that we have fewer journalists, fewer reporters there, and that makes it somewhat more difficult to get a full picture of what exactly is going on. So clearly there is a Russian offensive underway. It does appear to be coming very close now to Kupiansk. It may actually have reached Kupiansk. It's not impossible, as I said, that Kupiansk is being attacked even as I make this program. But for the moment at least, I can't confirm that. We don't have the detail, the level of information that would make it possible to say whether or not that is true. Now, that's the situation on the battlefronts. In some ways, the biggest story in the war yesterday was not these attacks, these advances and counter-advances in the battlefronts, though I would stress what happens at Kupiansk potentially, and the Oskol River potentially, is very important. The Russians do capture Kupiansk, especially if they move on and take other places like ETHEREUM, Balaklia, and perhaps Liman, and conceivably Siversk as well, then that will put them in a position where they're in a much stronger place to launch attacks against Slavyansk, one of the two big remaining towns that Ukraine controls in north-central Donbass alongside Kramatorsk. The character of the war will then change. And of course, as I said previously, the psychological effect on Ukraine and perhaps on some of its Western sponsors, if the gains of the Kharkiv offensive that Ukraine achieved last year are rolled up and reversed, the psychological effect of that could be enormous. But, as I say, putting all that aside, the big news was not perhaps the situation on the battlefronts. It was that we had another massive Russian missile strike with cruise missiles taking place across Ukraine. And again, once more, missiles of many types and varieties appear to have been used. So first of all, we had a drone strike with Uranium-2 drones. Then at one point, there were reports that up to 16 Russian strategic bombers were in the air, Tupolev 95s, and allegedly a single supersonic Tupolev 160, that all of these bombers were launching large numbers of missiles. Again, it's far from clear how many, but these would have been presumably the KH-101 missiles that the Russians now increasingly, which the Russian strategic air forces use. There were also launches of Kalibr missiles from ships in the Black Sea. And anyway, there were attacks right across Ukraine, focusing now on military targets. And my impression was, again, major targets were air bases. The Russians appear to be hunting, amongst other things, the air base installations from which Ukraine continues to operate, or try to operate, its Sukhoi 24 jets with their Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, soon to be joined by Taurus missiles as well. That the Russians are systematically attacking all of these airfields, hunting these aircraft, looking to destroy the airfields from which they operate. And anyway, it was an enormous attack, one which, it must be said once more, is difficult to assess. And this has happened following other attacks on Kiev. And there was a day before, or might have been 2 days before, a big attack on Kiev, to be precise, on the Zheleny airfield. And there are suggestions that Kinjal missiles launched from MiG-31 fighter bombers based in Belarus and Western Russia took part in this attack. And there are some reports again that the target was the Patriot missile batteries located at this airbase, and that there are rumours once more, including rumours coming out of Turkey, that more of these Patriots were destroyed, more of these Patriot launchers were destroyed over the course of these attacks on this airfield. Perhaps unsurprisingly, both the Russians and the Ukrainians and Ukraine's Western allies are providing very little information about these attacks. But anyway, that's where we are. And it's increasingly clear that despite more Ukrainian claims about their successes shooting down these Russian missiles. It's clear that, in fact, large numbers of these missiles, it's unclear to me how many missiles were in fact launched, but large numbers of these missiles are indeed getting through, and there are pictures that confirm this. There's photographs and film evidence. Not easy to obtain in Ukraine, where it is actually a criminal offence, for example, to show a missile impacting a target. Anyway, there's no doubt that this is indeed going on, and on a significant scale, despite all of these Ukrainian claims that they're shooting these missiles down. So, there we go. We see Pushilin talking about an offensive ebbing away. We see Western reports, especially in the American media, worrying about the same thing. We see fears that the offensive is not succeeding. There's been more reports about, there was one in the Washington Post. There was another one, I'm not sure which newspaper this was now, but Ukraine's national narrative and perseverance, narrative of unity and perseverance is beginning to fray. We've had another article, is Ukraine's counteroffensive turning out to be a bust? It's all in the American media now. And there's been more and more about this, and also more and more doubts about President Biden's strategy. And President Biden's Ukraine's strategy is failing. Again, I think this is from The Hill. So we see all of these reports in the American media, especially the American media. There's growing doubts about the offensive, about the entire strategy of the administration, but no real plan about what to do going forward. Instead, lots of comforting talk, even as the Russians close in on Kupiansk, even as Ukraine's offensive is failing. Somehow, what is going to happen in the future is going to be some sort of stalemate, which will buy the administration time as the 2024 election looms over the horizon. Well, I'm not going to discuss this in detail any longer. I think this is a topic I've discussed many times. I don't think there's any prospect of a stalemate. It seems to me what we are looking at the moment is not a stalemate, but what one might call an unstable equilibrium. The Ukrainians have been pulling out every stop, exerting themselves in every conceivable way that they can to break through these impenetrable Russian defense lines, whereas the Russians, for their part, are not so far exerting all the force that is at their disposal. They're biding their time, building up their forces, preparing for the moment when they are going to land their blow. And of course, we don't know what that is. They're not sharing that information with us. There's lots of speculation about when that might happen. But anyway, the key thing to say is that this is an unstable equilibrium. It is not a stalemate. It will be the Russians who will ultimately make the decision when and if they choose to break it. Now, there has been some very interesting information, both about Ukrainian and about Russian casualties. Now, one of the interesting things is that in terms of independent media, at least a part of independent media, the primary focus has been on trying to work out how many casualties Ukraine has experienced. And this is extremely difficult. And I've commented in the past about the fact that we don't have objective data that would enable us to work this out, to get some sense of what the actual figures of Ukrainian losses truly are. And in one of my recent programs, I made the point that the BBC and Mediazona jointly run a project administered by Mediazona, which looks at, tries to assess Russian losses based on investigation of obituary notices, hospitalizations, that kind of thing, death certificates, published in open sources across Russia. And at the moment, we have figures that come from the BBC and Mediazona, which give the impression that we're looking at losses of around 30,000 men killed. And I have expressed my opinion for a long time that these studies by the BBC and Mediazona are actually following sound methodologies. They give what is undoubtedly a minimum figure for the number of Russian fatalities. They speculate that Russian fatalities are much greater, but I don't really see their grounds for thinking that. But in any event, this is an important and useful series of studies, and they do give us a clear picture, at least an interesting and insightful picture, of what is actually happening in terms of Russian losses on the battlefronts. And in a recent program, I made the point that the BBC, for its part, I'm surprised that the BBC, for its part, is not doing the same in trying to assess Ukrainian losses. After all, the BBC has a duty of objectivity, of providing balanced information to the British public. That was how it acquired its reputation decades ago, when it became, for much of the world, the go-to source for world news. Now, I'm not going to comment at this point to what extent that reputation for impartiality was ever fully there. I think, in fairness, that the BBC, as I remember it, once upon a time, made a genuine aspiration towards impartiality, even if, like most aspirations, it never fully achieved it. But anyway, let's put that aside. Fact is, it does have that aspiration, it does have that public duty, and by conducting a study of Russian losses, but ignoring or failing to commission a balancing study of Ukrainian losses, I feel, and this has been, by the way, the view of another commentator who has written to me, this is another private email, I don't want to give away anything about this person's identity, but just want to say that I do agree with him. But anyway, by failing to conduct a similar analysis using a similar methodology to arrive at Ukrainian figures, the BBC is failing in its duty to be objective and to aspire to be impartial. Because in any study of a war, in any way, in any process of trying to work out who is actually winning or losing, comparing the casualties of one side against those of another must, or so it seems to be, form a part. Now, doesn't mean that the party that is suffering the lower casualties is necessarily winning the war. There have been many cases when it has been otherwise. For example, during the Vietnam War, most people would agree, in fact the Vietnamese government itself asserts, that North Vietnam and its Viet Cong allies in the south suffered far greater casualties than the American army they were fighting. Anybody disputes that. Yet nonetheless, and despite that, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong did eventually win. But nonetheless, trying to form a picture, an accurate picture of what is going on in a war, you're not going to get it if you get what look like reliable estimates of the casualties of one side, but what looks like a decision, because it can only be a decision, not to seek similar figures about the casualties on the other side. Now, I say that the methodology used to assess these Russian losses by Mediazona, as I said, seems to me sound. You look at obituary notices, you look at funerals, figures for funerals, you do all of that kind of thing. It requires a team to collect and analyze this data, but that isn't beyond the realm of the possible. It can be done, it has been done, and we've recently, by the way, had some evidence which appears to corroborate that the figures that the BBC and Mediazona are giving us for Russian casualties are roughly true. Now, this comes from certain comments made by General Teplinsky, who is the head of Russia's airborne forces. And he mentioned, somewhat obliquely, that over the course of the special military operation, something like 8,500 members of the Russian airborne forces, paratroopers, have been wounded. And some people have pointed out that given that usually the ratio of killed to wounded being 2 or 3 wounded for every 1 killed, that gives a total of killed in action for the Russian airborne forces of between 2,000 to 4,000. And Mediazona has verified losses for the Russian airborne forces, men killed from the airborne forces. It's assessed them at 1,600. Lower than these figures, but not dramatically so. And if we're looking at perhaps the more realistic calculation of 2,000 killed for 8,500 wounded, the figure 1,600 doesn't look that far off. So we see that, we're getting a fair breakdown from Mediazona and the BBC of Russian losses. They're on the low, there are minimum losses. True figures are higher, unquestionably, but not that much higher. So, why do they not do the same for Ukraine? It's possible to do it. It would give us a much better sense of what is going on in the war. Now, Mediazona, as I accept, might not be willing to do it. They are a group who have particular opinions, which they're fully entitled to have, about the Russian government, about the war, about all of those things. But the BBC is a state-funded public broadcaster with, as I said, an apparent duty towards objectivity and an aspiration to impartiality. So they got resources. This is an important issue, one that they can certainly get the same kind of data for, from Ukraine as they have from Russia. There are doubtless partner bodies, partners they could find similar to Mediazona who could undertake the same research. Why don't they do this? After all, I've no doubt that the BBC has those resources, and if it doesn't, well, it can probably find ways of obtaining them. It is a vast bureaucracy. It has connections with the British state. It often comes up under all kinds of criticism, but for an important task of this kind, why doesn't it do it? Well, I think the only straightforward answer to that has to be that they are afraid of what they will find. They're afraid that what they will find is that Ukrainian losses are multiples greater than the losses that Russia is suffering from. And since that is not the impression that Ukraine or Western governments want to convey, the BBC, conscious of its dependence on the British government, which after all ultimately legislates the mechanisms whereby the BBC is funded through the license fee. Anyway, one way or the other, they don't want to take a line that might undermine the claims of Western governments and of the Ukrainian government itself. Now, I think this is actually very bad for the BBC, bad for the British public, bad for the public generally. It means that we're not getting the kind of information which we could be getting, which would enable us to get a sense of Ukrainian losses. But there we are. I don't expect that to change. Fact is that Ukrainian losses are very heavy, much heavier than the Russian, probably multiples greater than the Russian. And that is why, ultimately, that is the single most important reason why Ukraine is not achieving breakthroughs. It is losing the war. And I think we need to be realistic about this and acknowledge that in this state of unstable equilibrium, it is Ukraine which is losing the war. Some people in the West might fantasize about stalemates. They might fantasize about resuming the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive in the autumn and the winter, or even the spring. They might fantasize about Ukraine achieving some great breakthrough in the summer of 2024. But the reality is, the objective reality is that Ukraine is losing. The Russians are growing stronger, Ukraine is growing weaker. The West's ability to keep Ukraine supplied with military equipment is dwindling. The Russians' ability to keep their own side supplied, their own army supplied with equipment, is growing. We'll come to that in a moment because I know there will be some pushback on the last point. But anyway, one way or the other, Ukraine is losing the war. And I'm going to say something else. I have spoken many, many times about my belief that the time window is not indefinitely open. The likelihood is, as I've said before, that once the Ukrainian offensive ebbs away, perhaps at the end of August, perhaps sometime in September, in advance of the coming of the autumn rains and of the Rasputitsa, it's likely we will have a period of calm in the offensive, in the war, though that is very conditional upon what the Russians might decide to do in the north. If they've captured Kupiansk, if they're moving towards ETHEREUM, if they've reached Balakleya, they might be using all of these places over the course of the winter as a springboard for some further offensive. either further south or further west, or whichever point of the compass they decide to go. But putting that aside, on the assumption that the Russians themselves are still in the process of building up their forces and regrouping in advance of whatever offensive they have in mind, and sooner or later, it seems to me, a Russian offensive is bound to happen. Well, the time interval between the failure of that Ukrainian offensive, and that Russian offensive which is coming, may not prove to be particularly long. And if a negotiation is going to be started before Ukraine faces disastrous failure, that is probably the last point, realistically, when it can happen. Now, I want to come back to the BBC. I said that it had an objective, a duty of objectivity, an aspiration towards impartiality. All of that, of course, stems from its overriding duty to keep the British public properly informed. And the British public, in this case, includes the British government itself. Bear in mind, as I've discussed many times, that though governments do get an awful lot of their intelligence from obviously their own intelligence agencies, it's also the case that all governments to some extent rely on the media to provide them with information. And from personal knowledge, I can say that that is very much the case with individual politicians, including politicians who hold government office. They read the media or they listen to the news and they get an awful lot of their information from there. So, given that that is so, given that the time window for a negotiation is probably only going to remain open for a relatively short time, given that the offensive is failing, and given that when the Russians begin their offensive against a perhaps mortally wounded Ukraine, the incentive for the Russians to negotiate might have gone. Surely it is the BBC's duty to keep the British public fully informed and the British government fully informed about Ukrainian losses as well as about Russian losses, if only so that the British government can make decisions about whether to support negotiations based on a full assessment of the facts. They need to know whether Ukraine is losing the war. They need to know what the scale of Ukrainian casualties is. They need to know all of that information in order to be able to assess whether the Ukrainian war effort is sustainable. So I make all these points because, of course, like everybody who lives in Britain and watches television here, as I do from time to time, I pay the license fee. And as somebody who pays the license fee, I would like to see in this war, as much as in every other, the BBC do what I think is its proper job. And I think it should do its job not just in its own interest, but in the wider interests of Britain, and by the way of Ukraine as well, because I cannot see that Ukraine gains anything from continuing a struggle which it is losing, given the scale of the losses which it is apparently suffering. And we've already had reports from places like The Guardian that Ukraine is now being forced to exhume bodies of dead soldiers left over from the Second World War in order to bury the fresh ones. We've heard reports that some Ukrainian units, specifically there's been the 5th Separate Assault Brigade, from the period between January 1st, 2023 to 31st July 2023, that it's lost a total of 1,845 irretrievable casualties. This is apparently based on a leaked Ukrainian document. It's been pointed out that's between 70 to 90% of its personnel over a 7-month period. We see more and more pictures of Ukrainian soldiers captured, giving rather sad descriptions about the state of the Ukrainian army. We see reports in the Western media that speak about the sad state of the Ukrainian army. And we've had so many reports now, including surveys, which confirm that most Ukrainians, indeed a significant majority of Ukrainians, now know of people who have been killed in the war, and usually of more than one such person. And there are anecdotal reports, by the way, coming back to those reports about amputations, that people with disabilities, with lost limbs in Ukraine are starting to become more visible in the streets and towns of the towns and cities across Ukraine. So, for all these reasons, in order to perhaps see some way to getting out of this horrible crisis, in order to get a proper sense of what is going on in the war, which is, anyway, the BBC's duty to provide and to provide an objective picture of the war. The BBC, it seems to me, has a clear-cut duty to look for a partner with whom it could carry out the same kind of survey to try to assess Ukrainian losses that it has been carrying out successfully for some months now, assessing Russian losses. Anyway, I hope I've made myself clear. I hope, by the way, that there are people in the BBC who are listening. Whether they decide to act on any of this is, of course, up to them. But it's absolutely clear to me what their obligations are. And to repeat for the last time, I feel they will be failing in those obligations if they don't do it. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the situation in this war for the moment. It seems to me, as I said, we have an offensive at a standstill. We see the Russians pounding Ukraine almost continuously right across from one end of its territory to another. We see what is increasingly looking like a successful and, for Ukraine, a very dangerous offensive launched by the Russians, starting to crystallize in the north with an attack on Kupiansk, perhaps days away. Now, that brings me to the next topic of my discussion today, which is the ruble and the central bank's decision to raise interest rates. Now, before I proceed, I'm going to read the statement the central bank itself published after it made its decision. And it's fairly short, and as is always the case with decisions of the central bank, statements of the central bank, it is also quite clear. And it said this: the Bank of Russia Board of Directors decided to increase the key rate by 350 basis points to 12% per annum from 15th August 2023. Now, 12% is an increase of 3.5%, 350 basis points. The previous position, the rate was 8.5%. That's already an increase from 7.5% just a few weeks ago. It's now almost doubled in the space of a few weeks, from 7.5% to 12%. Well, not quite doubled, but it's increased by something like 2/3. And then the central bank goes on to say this: the decision is aimed at limiting price stability risks. Inflationary pressure is building up. As of 7th August, the annual rate of inflation rose to 4.4%, whilst current price growth rates continue to increase. Over the last 3 months, current price growth amounted to 7.6% on average in annualized terms on a seasonally adjusted basis. The same core inflation measure went up to 7.1%. Steady growth in domestic demand, surpassing the capacity to expand output, amplifies the underlying inflationary pressure and has impact on the ruble's exchange rate dynamics through elevated demand for imports. Consequently, the pass-through of the ruble's depreciation to prices is gaining momentum, and inflation expectations are on the rise. That last paragraph, those last two sentences, provide the complete explanation, in my opinion, for the ruble's ongoing depreciation. Briefly, the Russian authorities underestimated the speed that the Russian economy was putting on in the second quarter. We now had more figures coming out. Industrial production rose 6.3% in the second quarter. GDP grew by 4.6% on an annualized basis. There was an industrial and economic surge, all of which was powered by a huge increase, by a big increase in demand. And Russian factories are struggling to cope with this increase in demand, which is driven by higher wages, caused to some extent by the decline in inflation last year and early this year, which led to real wages increasing in value, and which was supplemented by the decisions of the Russian government last year, worried by a fall in demand, to increase demand by encouraging a growth in wages. So what has happened is that as wage growth has expanded, it's inevitably led to an increase in credit growth as well. People are taking out more loans in order to buy more goods. And factories are racing to keep up with demand, and they're finding it difficult to do that because of supply and capacity constraints, and the result is imports are being sucked in at a faster rate than the central bank wants to see, and that in turn is putting pressure on the ruble, with Russia's trade surplus diminishing and with Russia's current account almost at the point when it is in balance, as opposed to the situation which the Russian government and the central bank prefer to see, which is one of healthy surplus. And that is what has happened. There was, as I said, a big rise in wages and credit growth over the course of the second quarter, and that's now feeding through into a rise in prices and pressure on the ruble. And that is the entirety of the story. There are all sorts of things that other people are saying. They bring up the subject of speculators. Speculators always are mentioned whenever a currency gets devalued, and they do exist. And there are people who do speculate against currencies, and sometimes successfully. George Soros, for example, was very, very successful in speculating against the pound sterling during the ERM crisis in 1992. But anyway, people like that do exist, but they are rarely the people who manufacture or engineer these crises, especially not against these exchange rate crises, if this one is a crisis, especially in the context of very big economies like Russia's or indeed Britain's. And there's also been stories that August is a month when lots of people in Russia decide to go on their foreign holidays, and they change their rubles into the currency of the country that they're visiting. And that, of course, does to a certain extent put downward pressure on the ruble as well, because there's a sudden demand for the currencies of the countries where these Russian tourists are going to. And yes, that does put some downward pressure on the ruble, but never to the extent that people that is going to change exchange rate dynamics overall. Of course, there is another thing, something which, of course, the central bank is not saying, that I have absolutely no doubt that it is true, which is that even as demand surged in the economy in the second quarter, and even as imports were flooding in, the Russian government and the central bank actually allowed the ruble to fall, and probably wanted it to fall, and probably assisted in doing that. Because, of course, a decline in the ruble, a fall in the ruble, makes Russian exports, oil, gas exports, food exports, exports of other products, with Russia gradually increasing export volumes of its non-commodity products. Anyway, it makes those more competitive on international markets and increases receipts to the state budget, where the government is currently running a deficit of around 2% of GDP, or to be precise, just below. The government is looking forward to these additional receipts and is apparently now predicting that it will run a budget surplus in the fourth quarter of this year. And I suspect that has been the objective all along. Anyway, that's why the ruble has fallen. And then the central bank goes on to say, hereinafter, with current price growth rates staying at the attained levels, the risk of inflation's deviation upwards from the target in 2024 is substantial. The target for 2024, by the way, is 4%. The Bank of Russia's decision is aimed at shaping monetary conditions and overall domestic demand dynamics necessary to bring inflation back to 4% in 2024 and stabilize it close to 4% further on. Moving forward in its key rate decision making, the Bank of Russia will take into account actual and expected inflation dynamics relative to the target and economic transformation processes, as well as the risks posed by domestic and external conditions and the reaction of financial markets. According to the Bank of Russia's forecast, given the monetary policy stance, annual inflation will return to 4%, which is, of course, the target in 2024. So, we want to bring inflation under control. That requires now stabilizing the exchange rate, and that's why they've raised interest rates. And they've raised interest rates by a hefty amount. A 3.5% increase, as I said, a 70% increase since over the last few weeks is a very big increase in interest rates indeed. It is going to make a difference. It is going to affect credit expansion within the Russian economy. It's going to make people more focused on keeping their money in banks to get more interest on their rubles while they're in their banks. That's going to reduce demand, as well as the sort of unwillingness to take on extra credit. There is a risk if interest rates remain at these levels for very long, that the very rapid expansion in the economy that we've been seeing over the last couple of months in Russia might reverse, though I expect that the central bank is aware of that, and I expect that once the situation has been brought under control and the situation has stabilized, the central bank will cut interest rates again. And this is the same point that's been made by the chairman of the State Duma Committee on the Financial Market, Anatoly Aksakov. He's been talking to TASS. He's close, I think, to the central bank. He says that there is a certain rush demand for foreign currency, and speculators' actions influence the situation. Well, as I said, undoubtedly there are speculators, but we can't assume that they're particularly important people. Anyway, he goes on to say the key rate was raised sharply to cool down their actions and the hype. I do not believe this is related to the inflation rate, as this would imply a lesser increase in the key rate. Well, I'm going to come to that in a moment. But he goes on to say demand is now stabilizing, and then they will adjust the level of the key rate depending on the market situation. And he he's basically indicating that as soon as the situation has been brought back under control, the central bank will cut interest rates. Now, coming back to what the central bank is saying and its decision to increase interest rates by 3.5%, I'm going to suggest that this is, in fact, precisely the sort of thing that Nabulina, the central bank chair, invariably does. He was very badly burnt in 2014, shortly after she'd been appointed chair of the central bank, by the Ruble crisis that took place in the late autumn of 2014, at a time when Russian banks and financial institutions and some companies, including, by the way, Rosneft, the big oil company, were under heavy pressure because at that time they had to repay loans that they owed to Western financial institutions which were unwilling to roll them over. So that caused a brief period when the central bank lost control of the situation with the ruble. And this is partly the result of Nabulina's own reluctance at that time to increase interest rates. She did not want to see the economy go into recession, and she did not want to take steps to support the ruble and to basically stabilize the situation. And in fact, the Ministry of Finance had to step in and start buying rubles in order to bring the situation back under control, which, by the way, it did very successfully. Anyway, I think that Nabulina has never forgotten that, and her response, whenever a situation like this arises, is to raise interest rates by substantially more than the market expects. So yesterday, Russian financial markets were speculating about an increase in interest rates of 1.5% to 2%, and Nabulina instead has raised interest rates by 3.5%, almost double the worst expectations of the Russian financial markets. So she's applying her own sledgehammer approach, and she does this probably factoring in all the interest rate increases that she was already penciled in for the rest of the year, leading up to the end of the year, when, with government spending starting to fall, she would have expected already that the ruble would start to stabilize and the inflation would start to show signs of reducing. And as I said, this is typical of Nabulina, and undoubtedly she also calculates that by taking this sledgehammer approach early, she gives herself a greater opportunity to do what Aksakov is talking about, which is cut interest rates further and sooner than she would otherwise have had the option to do. That is also something else that Nabulina tends to do. She raises interest rates a lot, stabilizes the situation, and then brings them down. Whereas in the West, as we have seen, the process of raising interest rates can go on for years. We've had interest rate increase after interest rate increase, all by amounts of quarter of a percentage point, or half a percentage point, quarter by quarter, steady, remorseless tightening of monetary policy, one protracted over a lengthy period. That is not Nabulina's style. She likes to do it all in one go and then bring the interest rates down again when she can. And she's indicating that she expects that the fall in the ruble is going to be only a temporary phenomenon. And she's done that in an interesting way, because in a second statement the bank published, shortly after it made this decision, Nabulina, or rather the central bank, said what central banks always do in these sorts of situations, that they're prepared to do whatever it takes, basically, to bring inflation under control. So they're giving themselves the option of raising interest rates beforehand, beyond that. But in reality, she's provided a signal to the banks that she expects that this period of ruble weakening will be short-term. And I'm going to take this report, I'm going to just comment on this. This is a machine translation of a report on Redovka, and it says that the central bank has refused new concessions to the banks. Credit institutions, the Central Bank of Russia has said that it does not plan to provide banks with the opportunity to fix the exchange rate, in order to hold the exchange rate firm for asset valuations. This was done during the ruble crisis of March last year. That time, the central bank allowed temporarily credit institutions to disregard, not to take into account losses from the depreciation of securities and negative currency revaluation. And they were told that they could also use the set exchange rate on February 18th, 2022 for calculations. This time, the central bank is refusing to allow banks to do that, financial institutions to do that. It says that they've made more than enough money recently to cover losses, and it's also signalling, as a point which has been made by several Russian experts, that by refusing to make this concession, the central bank is also signalling that it expects the weakening of the ruble to be short-term. Now, when I say all of this, short-term does not mean that things are going to turn round immediately. There's probably going to be some more downward pressure on the ruble for some time. Credit growth doesn't stop the next day after interest rates have increased. Well, it might slacken, but it takes usually a couple of weeks for these things to work their way through the system. Real wages in Russia are still growing. So it's quite likely that we're going to continue to see for some period of time, for some weeks, a weaker ruble, which will, of course, elicit the usual articles in the media in the West, even in Russia to some extent, about the crumbling ruble, the collapsing ruble, and all of these things. As I have discussed many times, I've been through this so many times already, and none of these apocalyptic predictions ever come to pass. The central bank has repeatedly shown that it can bring the situation under control. They did so in much more difficult conditions last year, in March last year. They can do it again. If they have to take further steps, they both can and will. But I think for the moment, they probably think that they've done enough. The danger is, and I've said this already, and I've said this before, if interest rates remain at this level for too long, that will bring growth in Russia to a stop. And we might even start to see a contraction. I don't think that is what Nabulina wants. I think that is why she's gone for this shock increase in interest rates now, so that she can cut interest rates back later. Anyway, I suspect I'm going to be doing more programs about the ruble before long. I suspect this story still has some way to go, but I hope I've made my feelings about this, my opinions about this clear. For some time, it's clear that the Russian government underestimated the extent to which the economy was responding to the stimulus it was provided last year in order to get it out of the recession that had hit Russia last year. The result is an economy that has overheated. The central bank, as central banks are required to do, or should do, is now taking steps to cool the situation down, and that, I predict, is what will happen. Well, this is where this program ends. More from me soon. There'll be, no doubt, back to this issue of the ruble again. I always get people very excited about this sort of thing. But anyway, we will discuss this again in the future, and we'll see what happens in the war. And I'm going to suggest that it is Kupiansk for the moment, which people should focus upon. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs. And remember, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also find, you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And of course, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.